The contract had 23 pages. Esther read all of them twice, pen in hand, without stopping once to drink the coffee cooling to her left. Not because she doubted the clauses, but because she doubted herself, and that was something she could not afford to show anyone. The conference room at Morel Holdings occupied the 42nd floor of a building Esther considered excessively tall for a company that still had something to prove to the market. Her father had ordered the top floor built as a trophy. She had turned the other 41 into an engine. 25 years old, chief executive for 18 months, and the company was still breathing, not in spite of her, but because of her. She turned the last page, closed the contract with a quiet slap of her palm, and raised her eyes to Dara, her assistant, who waited at the entrance with the posture of someone who knows the answer hasn't come yet. "Schedule the meeting with legal for Thursday," Esther said, "and cancel tomorrow's lunch with Rania. Your cousin will call 10 times. Let her call 11. She was already on her feet, pulling her blazer from the back of the chair. "If she wants to find me, she can show up on Thursday too. She gets 2 minutes to prepare just like everyone else." Dara wrote it down without blinking. 5 years working with Esther Morel had completely cured any impulse to question her logic. What no one understood, and Esther had never wasted time explaining, was that every decision that looked cold had something warm running underneath it. Her father's company had been built on gentlemen's agreements, geographic luck, and the irresistible charisma of a man who knew how to shake the right hand at the right moment. All of it had worked magnificently for 30 years. And then the market changed. And then her father got sick. And then there was only Esther. She moved down the corridor toward the main office with the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are stepping, not because the path is easy, but because she laid every stone there herself. 2 directors greeted her with nods that carried that slight excess of respect she recognized as fear, dressed up as admiration. She chose not to distinguish between them. Both were useful. Her phone vibrated. The name on the screen was the only one that made Esther slow her pace. "Baba," she answered before the second ring. "Did you read it?" His voice was softer than it had been 6 months ago. The illness had done that, not broken him, but rounded the edges of a man who had spent his entire life being an angle. "I read it." She stepped into her office and closed the door with her foot. "I'm still thinking." "Esther." A pause. "There isn't much time to think." She knew that tone. It was the tone he used when the decision was already made, and what he wanted was her blessing, not her opinion. "The Khalils are solid," he continued. "Sheikh built his empire from nothing, just like I did. The merger protects both sides. And Fuad. I know who Fuad is." She said the name without inflection, which was, in itself, an inflection. "Baba, I need you to give me until Thursday. You have until Thursday." Silence. "I love you, my daughter." She closed her eyes for half a second. "I know." 800 kilometers away, Fuad Khalil was finishing a phone call he had not asked to make. He stood by the panoramic window of his apartment in Dubai for a stretch of time he could not have measured, looking down at the city with the expression of someone calculating distances, not between buildings but between choices. 28 years old, an heir by name, a builder by decision. There was a difference, and he insisted on it every time someone tried to credit the Khalil surname with what had cost him personally. 3 years in markets nobody wanted. 2 companies of his own opened before he turned 25. A reputation that did not need his father to stand on its own. But fathers do not disappear just because their sons grow up. Sheikh Khalil had called at 7 in the morning, which for anyone who knew the man was not a phone call. It was a decree with a warm-up. The conversation had lasted 14 minutes. Fuad had spoken for perhaps 2 of them. He was not the kind of man who argued out loud. Disagreement for him was silence followed by action. But this time the silence carried a different weight, because his father's argument was not emotional, was not pride, was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was survival. The Khalil expansion into the market the Morels dominated had been stuck in local bureaucracy for 2 years. Local partners had failed. Time and money had been spent without return. And the window, that specific window, with that specific regulation that would expire in 18 months, was closing. The merger resolved in 6 weeks what normal negotiations would not resolve in 3 years. Fuad knew this. He had run the numbers himself before his father finished speaking. What he had not said to his father, and would not say because there was information one kept not out of weakness but out of strategy, was that there was a second reason. A reason Shaky had mentioned only in passing, almost as a footnote. The family needs to continue, Fuad, you know what that means. An heir. The word had not been spoken, but it had filled every centimeter of that pause. Fuad turned off his phone screen and pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window for exactly 1 second. The precise amount of time he allowed himself for anything that resembled weakness. Then he straightened up, opened his laptop, and started searching. The name appeared first in 3 executive profiles, 2 business articles, and a magazine feature she clearly had not asked to be part of, because the photo was institutional, not posed, and the quote was too technical to have come from a publicist. The market does not wait for those who ask permission. He looked at the photo longer than he had planned. Not for the reason any other man would look, but because there was something in the angle, in the posture, in the framing she had clearly not controlled and which still did not make her smaller, that he recognized as familiar. The posture of someone accustomed to being the only adult in the room. Fuad closed the laptop, crossed his arms, and thought for the first time since waking that perhaps this negotiation was going to be more complicated than his father imagined. At that same hour, in another city, a woman named Rania Morel sat in front of a computer in a doctor's office she had chosen herself, not the best, not the most expensive, but the most discreet. On her lips was a smile that did not reach her eyes. On the screen before her a report, official, stamped, with Esther's name at the top. The doctor had been easy to persuade. Money buys a great deal when the buyer smiles in the right way. Rania printed the document calmly, folded it in 3, slipped it into the envelope that was already addressed. Her cousin had been given everything her entire life. The company, the approval, the love of a father who had looked at Rania and seen only a name with the wrong last name. It was only fair, Rania had decided, that Esther have at least one thing less. She closed the computer and left the office without looking back. Esther did not sleep that night. Not from anguish, she was not given to that, but from calculation. She sat on the apartment balcony with a cup of tea that went cold 3 times, looking out at the city with the eyes of someone running numbers in their head. The company, her father, a future that depended on a decision no one should make alone, and that she would have to make exactly that way. At 3 in the morning she stood up, went to the table, opened the contract again. This time she read only the last clause. And this time when she closed the pages, there was no doubt in the gesture. There was resignation. The mature kind, which does not hurt like defeat, but weighs like responsibility. She was going to get married. For reasons that made sense. For reasons she had chosen. For reasons no cousin, no board, no circumstance had imposed. Because Esther Morel was not the kind of woman who let anything be imposed on her. What she did not know, what no one knew except a woman with an addressed envelope, was that the foundation of that decision had already been poisoned before it existed, and that the poison, this time, was not going to kill. It was going to create. The morning of the first meeting arrived the way all important mornings did, without announcement, without ceremony, as if the day had no idea what it was carrying. Esther had been in the building for 2 hours before anyone else arrived. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that she had changed her outfit 3 times, something she would have denied under oath, and had finally settled on the charcoal suit that her assistant once described as the one that makes people forget to argue with you. She had not corrected the description. The Khalil delegation was scheduled for 10. At 9:58, the elevator opened. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, but the particular quality of silence that preceded him into the room. The kind of silence that happens when everyone present unconsciously adjusts their posture. Fuad Khalil walked in like a man who had already decided the outcome of every meeting he had ever attended. Not arrogant in the loud way, nothing so easy to dismiss. He was arrogant in the architectural sense, like a building that does not need to announce its height. You simply look up and understand. He was taller than the photographs suggested. The suit was dark, no tie, which in this context was not casual. It was a statement, a deliberate subtraction that said, I do not need the full uniform to outrank everyone in this room. He scanned the space in one motion, the board members, the legal team, the presentation screens, and then his eyes landed on Esther. She was standing at the head of the table. She had not moved toward him. She had not extended her hand first. She simply stood there and let him come to the realization of where the authority in this room was located. It took him approximately 2 seconds. She counted. Ms. Morel. His voice was even, controlled in a way that suggested controlling it required no effort at all, which was, she noted, the most dangerous kind of control. Mr. Khalil. She gestured to the chair across from hers, not the one beside her. Across. The geometry was intentional, and she suspected from the slight pause before he moved that he understood it perfectly. He sat. She sat. The room breathed again. The first 40 minutes were professional in the way that battlefields are sometimes quiet, not because there is peace, but because both sides are still deciding where to strike. Esther presented the merger structure with the precision of someone who had built it from scratch, which she had. No slides she hadn't written herself. No numbers she couldn't defend without notes. When the Khalil legal team pushed back on the revenue-sharing model in the third quarter projection, she didn't look to her team. She answered directly, with the calm specificity of someone who anticipated the question 3 days ago and found it slightly disappointing it had taken this long to arrive. Fuad watched her more than he watched the presentation. Not conspicuously. He was too disciplined for that. But Esther had spent years in rooms full of men who thought they were being subtle, and she had developed a peripheral accuracy that most people didn't know was a skill. He was not watching her the way men usually watched her in boardrooms, that particular combination of surprise and condescension that she had learned to metabolize without breaking stride. He was watching her the way she imagined he watched anything he was trying to understand. Carefully, like a problem he hadn't solved yet. She found it, against her better judgment, slightly more interesting than she'd expected. At the 43rd minute, he spoke for the first time beyond formal responses. The 18-month timeline is optimistic. Not a question, not quite an accusation. A statement dropped into the middle of the room like a stone into still water, and everyone waited to see the ripple. Esther set her pen down. It's precise, she said. Regulatory approval in that corridor has averaged 26 months over the last 4 years, for applications that were filed without local infrastructure already in place. She held his gaze without effort. Ours has been in place for 14 months. The timeline accounts for that. If your team had reviewed the appendix on page 41, that context is there. A pause. One of the Khalil advisors shifted in his seat. Fuad did not shift. He reached forward without looking away from her and turned to page 41. He read for 11 seconds. You built the infrastructure before the merger was agreed, he said. I built it because the market needed it, she said. The merger is a consequence, not a cause. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite surprise, but its more composed cousin. Recalibration. That's either very confident, he said, or very reckless. Those are the same thing, Esther said. Until they work. The formal meeting ended at 12:30. The families had arranged a lunch, both fathers' idea, executed with the efficiency of people who had been planning this longer than they'd admitted. A private room in the kind of restaurant that didn't need a sign outside. The table was set for 8 but felt intimate in the suffocating way that only family gatherings managed. Shaky Khalil was a large man in every sense, physically imposing, energetically dominant, the kind of presence that reorganized a room around itself without asking. He embraced Esther's father like an old ally, which they were, and looked at Esther with the specific warmth of a man who had already decided to like her, and was simply waiting for the formality of meeting her to confirm it. She appreciated the honesty of it. Most people pretended the decision hadn't already been made. "Your father tells me you ran the merger structure yourself," Shaky said, settling into his chair. "My father is generous," Esther said. "He said precise, actually." Shaky smiled. He used the word precise. Across the table, Fuad was listening without appearing to listen, a skill Esther recognized because she used it herself. Lunch moved with the careful choreography of people being civil about something none of them were ready to name directly. The merger, the arrangement, the thing sitting in the center of the table that everyone was eating around. It was Fuad who finally named it. Not loudly, not to the table. He leaned slightly in her direction while the fathers were debating something about golf, and said, at a volume meant only for her, "You knew about this before the meeting." Not the merger. The other thing. She picked up her water glass. "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough to decide." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to push further or to respect the boundary she had drawn with those 4 words. She found herself genuinely curious which way he would go. "And you decided," he said. Not a question this time either. A different kind of statement, one that held underneath it something that might have been respect if he'd been willing to let it surface fully. "I'm here," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he picked up his own glass. "So am I," he said. They did not speak again for the rest of the lunch, but twice. Once when her father made a joke that was funnier than expected, and once when Shaky said something in Arabic that Fuad translated without being asked because he noticed she hadn't understood. She caught him in an unguarded half-second. Not soft, not warm exactly, but present in a way that was different from the boardroom. She filed it away without examining it. On the way out, while the fathers lingered and the assistants gathered coats, Fuad fell into step beside her for approximately 30 seconds in the corridor. "You moved first in that room today," he said. She knew which moment he meant, the seat placement, the geometry. "I always do," she said. "I know." A pause. "I'm noting it for next time." She pushed the door open herself, not waiting, not inviting, not performing independence, but simply exercising it, and said without looking back, "I'd expect nothing less." She was in the car before she allowed herself to think about what had just happened. Not the merger, not the arrangement, not even the way the day had unfolded, but the specific feeling of being in a room with someone who was not impressed by her, and was not threatened by her either. She looked out the window at the city moving past. It was, she decided, going to be a problem, the kind of problem she did not yet have a clause for. They were married on a Thursday, not because Thursday held any particular meaning for either of them, but because the lawyers had cleared the contracts by Wednesday evening, and both families operated on the shared philosophy that momentum once built should not be wasted on sentiment. The ceremony was private. Immediate family only, which still amounted to 31 people in a room designed for 20. Esther wore ivory, not white, not cream ivory, a choice that her mother had not commented on, which meant she had noticed everything. Fuad arrived before her, which she had not expected, and stood at the front of the room with the stillness of a man who had made his decision and was no longer interested in debating it with himself. She walked in alone. Her father had offered his arm at the door and she had taken it, not because she needed the support, but because he needed to give it. And she understood the difference. When she reached the front and stood beside Fuad for the first time in that particular context, he glanced down at her for exactly 1 second before looking forward again. She looked forward too. Neither of them smiled for the photographs. Later, reviewing the images at her assistant's insistence, she noticed this and found it, unexpectedly, the most honest thing about the entire day. The first week of marriage was a study in parallel architecture. The Khalil estate where they were expected to reside during the initial transition period was large enough that two people could move through it for hours without encountering each other. Something Esther suspected had been a feature of the design, rather than an accident. She kept her work schedule unchanged. He kept his. They shared dinner 4 times out of 7, which was more than she had projected and less than the household staff seemed to expect. The dinners were not uncomfortable. That, more than anything, confused her. Fuad was not a man who performed ease. If the conversation at dinner was measured and careful, it was not because he was trying. It was because he was genuinely, selectively interested in certain things and entirely unbothered by silence in between. He asked questions that were direct without being intrusive. He did not explain himself unless asked. He corrected her once, on a market figure she'd cited incorrectly, without softening the correction or following it with anything conciliatory. She corrected him back the following evening on a regulatory detail he'd gotten slightly wrong. He paused, then nodded once. She picked up her fork. It was, she thought, the closest thing to a compliment either of them had exchanged. By the 5th evening, she had identified his pattern. He read for an hour after dinner, always standing near the east window, always with the same posture, weight on the left foot, book held slightly lower than most people held them. As if he'd taught himself to read at a desk and never fully adjusted. He did not know she had noticed. She intended to keep it that way. By the 6th day, something had quietly, without permission, begun to shift. She did not examine it. She was not ready to examine it. But she felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself, just the particular quality of everything just before it. She told him on the 7th night. She had planned to wait. She had planned a careful approach, practical framing, logical sequencing, the kind of conversation structure that kept emotion at the perimeter where it couldn't interfere with the actual information. She had planned it the way she planned everything. But he walked into the study where she was working, set 2 cups of coffee on the table without being asked. Black for her, the way she took it, which meant he had noticed at some point and filed it without commenting, and sat down across from her with the natural ease of someone who had somehow in 7 days stopped being a stranger in her space. And she looked at him and thought, "Now, there's something I should have told you before the wedding," she said. He looked up from his phone. Set it down. She appreciated that, the full attention. She had not expected it to matter, and it did. The Morel succession, she said. The heir, the part of this arrangement that wasn't only about the merger. She kept her voice level. Not cold. She was not performing coldness. But steady, the way you keep a hand steady when it wants to shake. I can't have children. The medical confirmation came before we married. I should have disclosed it. I didn't, and that was wrong, and I'm telling you now. The room was very quiet. Fuad did not move. He sat with the same stillness he brought to everything. But this was a different quality of stillness, not the controlled kind. The kind that happens before a decision. You knew, he said, not loudly, not even with visible anger. Which was, she understood immediately worse. You knew before the contracts were signed. Yes. Before the ceremony. Yes. He stood up. Slowly. The movement was deliberate in the way that very contained fury makes all movement deliberate, because the body understands that speed would cost something. I married you for a merger that could have been structured a dozen other ways, he said. The one element that was not negotiable, the one condition my father... He stopped, pressed 2 fingers briefly to his jaw, resumed with the same terrible quiet. You made a decision that was not yours to make alone. I know. You are the most competent person I have sat across a table from in 3 years. The words came out not as a compliment but as something more complicated, an accusation that cost him something to make, and you used that competence to manage me. She said nothing, because he was not wrong, and she had already decided she would not dress it in justification. He picked up his jacket from the chair. I need to not be in this building right now, he said, and he walked out. The front door did not slam. He was too controlled for that. The silence it left behind was worse than any sound. Esther sat with the 2 cups of coffee for a long time, one hand flat on the table, breathing with the deliberate evenness of someone managing something that had not yet decided what shape it was going to take. She was not surprised by his reaction. She had modeled it. She had known exactly what it would look like, and she had told herself, in the days leading to this conversation, that knowing the shape of something meant you were prepared for it. She had been wrong about that. She stood eventually, moved toward the window. The grounds below were lit and empty and indifferent in the way that expensive landscapes are always somehow indifferent. Then it arrived. Not dramatically. Nothing about it was dramatic, which was in fact the most disorienting part. Just a wave of nausea, quiet, specific, and entirely unlike anything she had eaten in the last 24 hours. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass and waited for it to pass. It passed. She stood there, thought nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then thought, that's the 3rd time this week. She turned away from the window slowly. Her mind was already moving, not emotionally, but clinically, with the same systematic precision she applied to everything she did not yet understand. 3 mornings, mild but consistent. A specific fatigue that her schedule did not account for. The coffee tonight that had smelled for just a moment before she touched it, like something she didn't want. She was not a woman who catastrophized. She was not a woman who panicked, but she was a woman who knew how to read data, and something in the data had just shifted. She sat back down at the desk, opened her laptop with steady hands, stared at the screen for a long moment before typing anything. Outside, somewhere past the gate, Fuad's car was already gone, and inside her chest, something very quiet and very irreversible had already begun. The test was positive. She had known before she read it. She had known the way you know something your mind hasn't finished accepting yet. With the body first, then the understanding, then the long silence in between where neither one is willing to go first. She sat on the edge of the bathroom counter for 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock, not because she needed to time anything, but because her mind required something mechanical to hold on to while everything else recalibrated. Pregnant. 2 weeks, according to the calculation, which meant before the wedding. Which meant the medical report she had trusted. The one that had arrived in a sealed envelope from a clinic she had not personally chosen, forwarded through the administrative channel her cousin Rania managed for family correspondence. Had been wrong. Not outdated, not misread. Wrong. She climbed down from the counter, washed her hands, looked at her own reflection with the directness she brought to every difficult thing, not searching for reassurance, not avoiding the image, just looking at it the way you look at a problem you are about to solve. She was pregnant. Her husband had walked out of this house 4 days ago, and somewhere between those 2 facts was a distance she did not yet know how to measure. She did not call him. Not because she was afraid of the conversation. She had never been afraid of a conversation in her life. But because she needed 48 hours to be certain of exactly what she was going to say and exactly how she was going to say it. Words, in her experience, were not different from contracts. The terms had to be right before you signed. What she had not accounted for was that Fuad would come back before she was ready. He arrived on the 5th morning. No call ahead, no message. She heard the car, then the door, then his particular footstep in the corridor. She had learned it without meaning to, the slightly longer stride on the right side, the weight that landed with more purpose than most people managed even when they were trying. She was at her desk. She did not stand. He appeared in the doorway of the study. He looked the same precision, the same self-containment, but with something that had not been there before. Not softness. Something more like a man who had made a decision about himself and was now living inside it. I was unreasonable, he said. She looked at him steadily. You were hurt. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No, she agreed. They're not. He came in and sat down, not across from her this time, but at the adjacent chair, the angle that was neither confrontation nor concession. The geometry, she noticed, had changed. I've been going through the merger filings, he said. The ones from the past 2 years, the stalled applications. He set a folder on the desk. Someone in the local approval chain has been routing Khalil submissions to a secondary review committee that doesn't technically exist. It's been running for 14 months. The bureaucratic delay was not bureaucratic. She opened the folder, read the first page, then the second. You found this in 4 days, she said. I find things faster when I'm angry. She kept reading. The pattern was unmistakable. Systematic misdirection, precise enough to look like procedure, deliberate enough that it couldn't have been accidental. Someone had wanted the Khalil expansion stalled. Someone had wanted it stalled long enough that a merger would look not just attractive but necessary. She looked up at him. Do you know who? I have a strong hypothesis. His voice was even. I don't move on hypotheses. Neither do I. She closed the folder. I'll put my forensic accounting team on the submissions trail. If the misdirection has a financial signature, they'll find it within a week. He looked at her for a moment. You're offering your team to a Khalil problem. I'm offering my team to a problem inside a merger I'm party to. She kept her voice neutral. That's not generosity. That's self-interest with better optics. Something shifted at the edge of his expression. Not a smile, but its very controlled ancestor. Your team, he said. Thursday. She told him that evening. They were in the kitchen, a location that had somehow become the only room in the house that felt entirely free of formal architecture. She had found him there on the second morning making coffee with the focused displeasure of a man who had opinions about the equipment and was not being given the opportunity to voice them. The observation had made her want to laugh, which had surprised her. She had not laughed, but she had noted it. Now he was standing at the counter reading something on his phone and she was across the room and she decided, without ceremony, that this was the moment. I need to tell you something, she said. He looked up, set the phone down. Full attention again, that same quality that had undone her the first time. She told him. She watched him process it with the same external stillness that she was beginning to understand, was not coldness but control, the defense mechanism of a man who had learned that his reactions could be used against him and had therefore internalized all of them. She watched the stillness absorb what she'd said, watched him work through the mathematics of it, the timeline, the implication, the impossible contradiction of what the medical report had stated. The report was wrong, he said eventually. Yes. You believed it. I had no reason not to. She met his eyes. I would never have. She stopped. Restarted with more precision. If I had known, I would have told you before the contracts. That is not the kind of information I would have managed. I want you to know that. He was quiet for a long time. The clinic, he said. Who sent you there? The appointment was forwarded through family correspondence. My cousin manages that channel. A pause. Something moved behind his eyes, rapid and contained, like a current beneath still water. Rania, he said. She had not said the name. She registered with a precision that had nothing to do with warmth, that he had been paying attention to far more than she had assumed. I don't have proof, she said carefully. No. He straightened. But you have a hypothesis. She held his gaze. Yes. He crossed to the other side of the counter. Stopped 2 feet from her. Close enough that this was no longer a conversation across a room, but close enough that it was not yet anything else. Are you all right? He asked. Not what does this mean for the arrangement. Not what happens now with the merger. Not any of the questions she had prepared answers for. Just that. She had not expected just that. I'm managing, she said, which was the most honest answer she had, and also, she realized as she said it, slightly less than what he had actually asked. He nodded once. Looked at her for a moment longer, with that particular quality of attention that she had stopped trying to categorize because it didn't fit any category she'd built. Then he said quietly and without preamble, I'll handle the clinic. I know you can. He said it without condescension. A simple statement of fact that somehow, precisely because it contained no surprise, landed differently than any compliment would have. "Let me." She looked at him. He did not look away. And in that specific silence, not the silence of two people avoiding something, but the silence of two people arriving at the same place from different directions, something happened that neither of them named, because neither of them had the vocabulary for it yet. She nodded. One small, unguarded movement. He turned and picked up his phone, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left the room, aware of something she had not been aware of that morning. That somewhere in the last hour, without a single word being exchanged that could be classified as emotional, she had allowed someone to stand in her corner. Not because she needed it, but because for the first time in longer than she could locate, she had not needed to refuse it. She sat down later at her desk, opened a new document, and began a list. The clinic, the report, the channel through which it had arrived, the timeline, Rania's access to that channel, the specific nature of what the fabricated result would have needed to say, and the particular knowledge required to know it would matter. She built the case the way she built everything, from evidence outward, without assumption, without the contamination of conclusion. By midnight, she had 6 columns and 42 data points. By 1 in the morning, she had something that wasn't quite proof, but was very close to the shape of it. She saved the document, closed the laptop, and sat for a moment in the quiet of a house that felt, strangely and without permission, less empty than it had a week ago. The story broke on a Tuesday. Not gradually, the way most things that damage people break, with warning signs and small fractures and the merciful time to prepare. It broke the way glass breaks when the pressure has been invisible, all at once without announcement in the middle of an ordinary morning. Esther was in a meeting with her forensic team when Dara appeared at the glass door with the specific expression she reserved for emergencies. Not panicked, Dara was never panicked, but carrying the particular stillness of someone holding something that is about to become very heavy. She stepped out. Dara handed her the tablet without speaking. The headline was from a financial news outlet with a circulation that reached every boardroom in the region, large enough to matter, reputable enough to be believed before it was verified. Moral holdings, merger, hidden conditions, and a bride who knew. Sources close to the Khalil family reveal undisclosed medical deception. She read the first 3 paragraphs standing in the corridor in complete stillness. Then she read them again. The article was careful. Carefully constructed in the specific way that articles are careful when someone with detailed knowledge has fed the information precisely, not recklessly, not with the bluntness of a grudge, but with the surgical patience of someone who wanted maximum damage from minimum exposure. It did not name sources. It did not need to. The details were too specific for distance. The framing of the medical disclosure, the timeline, the wording, the characterization of Esther's decision to proceed with the wedding as deliberate concealment, read like the interior of a conversation that had never been public. Someone in the house had talked, or someone had listened. Her phone began vibrating before she reached the end of the article. Fuad saw it 4 minutes after she did. He was at the Khalil offices across the city when his communications director walked in without knocking, which had happened twice in 3 years, and both times had been significant. He read the article in silence, read it again, set the phone face down on the desk with a care that was more controlled than any force could have been. His father called 11 seconds later. "Tell me this is being managed," Shaky said. No greeting. His voice carried the specific temperature of a man who built things over decades and knew exactly what erosion sounded like. "I'm handling it. The board is going to want a statement by end of day. The merger vote is in 3 weeks, Fuad. 3 weeks." A pause waited with 30 years of everything Shaky had constructed and everything he believed his son had been positioned to protect. "I need to know what happened. I'll call you in 2 hours. Fuad." 2 hours, Baba. He ended the call, stood, picked up his jacket, and drove to the Morel building in 19 minutes through traffic that should have taken 35. She was in her office when he arrived. Standing, she did not sit during crises. She moved, But the room was not large enough for the kind of movement she needed, so she had stopped moving and was standing at the window instead, phone to her ear, voice low and precise. He closed the door behind him. She held up one finger without turning, one moment, and finished the call with the clipped efficiency of someone dismantling a fire while declining to run. Then she turned. They looked at each other across the office. There was a specific quality to the silence, charged not with anger between them, but with the recognition of damage done by something outside both of them, which was in some ways worse. Anger between two people can be resolved between two people. This required a different kind of navigation. The detail about the timing, he said, the specific wording around the disclosure, that came from inside the house, or from someone with access to someone inside the house. She crossed to her desk, opened her laptop, turned it toward him. On the screen, her document from 2 weeks ago, the 42 data points, the 6 columns. At the bottom, a 7th column she had added 4 days after the first, cross-referencing Rania's movements against the household calendar for the period she and Fouad had been in residence. 3 overlaps. A visit under the pretext of a family lunch, a delivery that had required a signature from someone on the interior staff, a phone call to the household coordinator that had lasted 22 minutes and concerned, nominally, a gift arrangement. Fouad studied the screen without touching it. She was building the article, he said, not a question. The medical story alone doesn't break a merger. She needed the emotional framing, the deception angle. She needed it to look like I knowingly withheld. Esther's voice was even in the way of someone who has metabolized the fury and is now running on the clean fuel beneath it. She seeded the clinic report months ago. She waited for the marriage to happen. Then she needed the interior detail to make the deception story credible. The household access gave her that. Who did she talk to inside? I know who. Oh, pause. I'm not moving on it until I have the financial record of what she paid. I want the full chain. He looked at her. That takes time we don't have. I know. The board meets in 3 weeks. If the merger vote happens with this story unaddressed, the Khalil block loses 2 members who are already looking for an exit. He said it without inflation, just the facts, delivered the way he delivered everything with the precision of someone who finds accuracy more useful than comfort. 2 members is the margin. She already knew. He knew she already knew. They were not exchanging information. They were doing something else, building shared ground under pressure. The way 2 people who have stopped pretending they're not on the same side start to actually operate like it. I need 48 hours, she said. You have 36. After that, the narrative calcifies. She nodded, reached for her phone. He did not leave. She glanced at him. I'm staying, he said simply, as if it were not a decision, but a fact of architecture, something the situation contained whether or not either of them had chosen it. She looked at him for 1 moment, then looked back at her phone. Then sit down, she said. We have a lot of calls to make. They worked for 11 hours. Not side by side in any romantic configuration. There was no time for configuration. They worked in parallel and in intersection, each pulling on the threads of their respective networks with the focused efficiency of people who had spent years building the kind of relationships that answer calls at 9 in the evening without asking why. Fouad's team traced the financial transfer to the clinic physician through 2 shell accounts and a consulting invoice that dissolved under 40 minutes of forensic scrutiny. By the time the paper trail was assembled, what Rania had done was not a hypothesis. It was a sequence. Esther's team pulled the article's sourcing pattern, cross-referencing the specific language used in the piece against communications metadata from the household coordinator's phone in the window following Rania's visit. The coordinator had not been malicious. She had been naive and underpaid, and Rania had been charming and specific about what she needed to know. By 11:30 they had enough. Not everything, but enough. Fouad set down his phone and looked across the table at Esther, who was reading the final document with the pen-in-hand posture he had first seen in the boardroom the day they met, fully present, processing at a speed most people never reached. She looked up. "It's enough," she said. "It's enough," he agreed. They sat in the quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of having done something very hard and arrived somewhere that wasn't a destination, but was at least solid ground. Then he said, without planning to, without the usual processing time he gave himself before any statement that mattered, "I don't think you deceived me." She was very still. "Not intentionally," he continued. "I think you believed the report. I think you made a decision with the information you had, and I reacted to the worst version of the story before I had all of it." A pause. "I'm telling you that now because I should have said it sooner, and I don't make a practice of letting those things run longer than necessary." She looked at him across the table. For a moment she said nothing, not deflecting, not managing, not performing composure, just looking at him with an openness that was the more remarkable for how rarely it appeared. "I should have told you before the wedding anyway," she said. "Whatever I believed. You deserved the information. The merger deserved it. You deserved it." The repetition was deliberate. She meant the distinction. "I made the decision alone because I'm used to making decisions alone, and I used competence as a reason not to be honest. That was wrong." The room was very quiet. "All right," he said. "Not I forgive you. Not, it's fine. Just all right." The word of a man who had received something genuine and was accepting it in kind. She nodded once. He nodded once. And somewhere in that spare, undecorated exchange, no performance, no embellishment, just two people telling the truth to each other in a room late at night when they were both tired and the city outside had gone quiet. Something shifted into a position it had been approaching for weeks. Neither of them named it, but both of them knew. At midnight she stood to get water and stopped in the kitchen doorway because the nausea came again. Swift and specific and no longer possible to file quietly under managing. She gripped the doorframe. Fuad was behind her in 3 seconds. She had not heard him move. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, and said nothing, which was exactly right, which she would think about later and not be able to fully explain. It passed. She straightened. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said, "but you should sleep." She turned to look at him. He was close. The house was quiet. The late hour had stripped everything back to something that felt very simple and very complicated at the same time. "Tomorrow," she said, "we release the full chain, the clinic, the payments, the sourcing, all of it." "Tomorrow," he agreed. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she said, very quietly and without looking away, "Thank you for staying." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the boardroom face, not the controlled fury face, not even the careful attention face she had catalogued over weeks of dinners and late evenings. Just his face. "Where else would I be?" he said. Not a question. The press release went out at 7 in the morning. Esther wrote it herself. Not because her communications team wasn't capable, they were exceptional and she had paid accordingly, but because the words needed to come from someone who had lived inside the facts, and there was only one person in the situation that qualified. It was not defensive, it was not emotional. It was precise in the way that irrefutable things can afford to be precise, laying out the sequence without commentary, letting the documentation carry the weight. The fabricated medical report. The financial transfer to the clinic physician. The sourcing trail from Rania to the household coordinator to the article. The timeline that showed, without ambiguity, that Esther had acted on information she had been deliberately given reason to believe. Fuad reviewed it at 6:45, read it once, handed it back. "Nothing to change," he said. She sent it at 7. By 9 the story had inverted. Not completely. These things never inverted completely. There were always people who preferred the first version because it was more satisfying, and Esther had long since stopped trying to reach them. But the documented chain was specific enough, and the financial evidence clean enough that the outlets that mattered ran the correction before noon. By early afternoon, 2 of the Khalil board members who had been wavering had sent formal communications to Fuad's office reconfirming their position on the merger vote. Rania did not call. She did not need to. Esther had sent a separate private communication that morning, not threatening, not cruel, not the kind of thing that required a response. Just the full documentation, transmitted directly, with a single line beneath it. I know everything. What happens next is your choice. She had not told Fuad about that message, not because she was managing him, she had promised herself she was done with that, but because some things between family, even broken family, belonged to the person who had to carry them. She would tell him later. She had learned, slowly and against her instincts, that later was not the same as never. Her father called at 10. I heard, he said. I know you heard. A pause. The kind her father used when he was working up to something he didn't have the right framing for yet. The Khalil boy, he said finally. He stayed. Yes. Through all of it. Yes, Baba. Another pause. Longer. I made a decision for you, he said. When I arranged this, I made a decision I had no right to make alone, and I told myself it was strategy, and I was also afraid of leaving you without something solid. I want you to know that I know the difference between those two things. She was quiet for a moment. I know why you did it, she said. That's not the same as it being right. No, she agreed. It's not. Are you all right? She looked out the window of her office at the city below, the same city she had looked at from this window for 18 months, the same view she had used to calibrate herself every morning before the day began. It looked today slightly different. She could not have said exactly how. I'm more than all right, she said, and meant it. The merger vote was held on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks later, in a room that held 41 people and the accumulated pressure of everything the two families had built and everything they stood to either protect or lose. Esther sat on one side of the table. Fuad sat on the other. Not because they were opposed, but because each of them represented their own entity, their own board, their own accountability, and neither of them had any interest in performing a unity that would have required them to be smaller than they were. The vote passed. 38 in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 absence. The room moved into the particular controlled celebration of people who express relief through handshakes and restrained smiles and the immediate pivot to implementation logistics. Both fathers embraced. Legal teams exchanged documents. The machinery that had been waiting engaged with the clean momentum of something that had been under pressure for a long time and was finally allowed to move. Esther accepted the handshakes, answered the questions, signed the documents with the same steady hand she brought to everything. Across the table she caught Fuad's eye once, just once for approximately 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds passed something that neither of them could have put in a contract and neither of them needed to. She looked away first, but she was smiling when she did. They drove home together. Not by arrangement. It simply happened the way things between them had increasingly simply happened over the past weeks, organically and without the negotiation that everything between them had once required. His car, her sitting in the passenger seat with her shoes off and her legs tucked sideways, reading something on her tablet, entirely at ease in a posture she would never have permitted herself in a professional context. He drove without speaking, which was not silence the way their early silences had been silence. Loaded and strategic and shaped around things neither was ready to say. This was the other kind, the kind that had nothing to hide. Halfway home, she set the tablet down. I've been thinking about the Eastern office, she said. The Khalil Eastern office or the Morel Eastern office. They're the same office now. He glanced at her. They will be in 6 months when the integration. I know the timeline. A pause. I'm already thinking past the timeline. He looked back at the road. Of course you are. There was something in his voice that was not quite amusement, but was in the same family, warm and specifically directed, the kind of tone that required knowing someone well enough to aim it precisely. She looked at him. Was that a complaint? It was an observation. It sounded like admiration. Those are occasionally the same thing, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back out the window with the small, controlled, almost smile she had developed specifically for things she found genuinely pleasing, but was not yet ready to be fully transparent about. He had noticed the smile 3 weeks ago. He had not mentioned it. He was waiting until she was ready to own it. That evening, she found him in the kitchen again. He had, at some point in the past month, quietly taken over the coffee situation with the focused competence of a man who had opinions about process and had finally been given the opportunity to act on them. She had not commented. She had simply started arriving in the kitchen at the approximate time the coffee was ready and accepting a cup as if this were a system she had always been part of. Tonight she came in and sat at the counter, and he set the cup in front of her, and she looked at it for a moment before looking at him. "I want to tell you something," she said. He leaned against the counter across from her, waiting. "When I agreed to this arrangement," she said, "I told myself it was a decision, a calculated one. I had reasons, and the reasons were real, and I stand by them." She kept her eyes on him, not performing steadiness, but actually steady, which was different and which he could tell was different. "What I didn't account for was you specifically. I made a decision about an arrangement, and then you turned out to be a person, and those are not the same problem." He was very still. "I'm not good at this part," she continued. "I am competent at an unusual number of things, and I am genuinely not good at this specific thing, and I'm telling you that directly because I think you deserve the direct version." A breath. Not quite a pause, shorter, more internal. "I'm not asking you for anything, I'm telling you where I am. I'm here. I chose this. Not the arrangement, not the contract. This. You." She picked up the coffee cup. "I thought you should know." The kitchen was very quiet. Fuad looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had stopped trying to classify, the one that was entirely his, that she had never seen on anyone else, that seemed to contain more than one thing at the same time without any of them canceling the others out. Then he came around the counter, stopped in front of her, close the way he had stood close in the kitchen weeks ago when the nausea came and the late hour had stripped everything back. Close enough to be a decision. "I have been," he said quietly, "trying to find a reason to trust what I feel about you since the second week of knowing you. Because I don't operate on feeling. I operate on evidence." He paused. "You are the evidence." She looked up at him. "That's the least romantic sentence anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I know." The corner of his mouth moved. "I meant every word of it." She laughed. Not the professional acknowledgement she deployed in meetings, not the polite version. An actual laugh, brief and unguarded and entirely real. And he watched it happen with the expression of a man encountering something he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. He reached out and touched her face with the same deliberateness he brought to every decision, not impulsive, not performing, just chosen. She let him. And then, because she had never been a woman who waited for permission, she closed the remaining distance herself. 3 months later, the Eastern office opened. The announcement featured both their names above the operational structure, not side by side in a symbolic arrangement, but integrated in the specific way that reflected how the work had actually been divided, by competence, by territory, by the particular strengths of two people who were still, and would probably always be, fighting for the same ground from different angles. A journalist asked in the press conference afterward which of them had driven the timeline. Esther and Fuad answered at the same moment. She said, "I did." He said, "She did." The room laughed. Neither of them did. But they glanced at each other with the brief private language of people who have developed a shorthand the rest of the world is not party to. Afterward, in the car, his car, her shoes off, the same configuration that had become its own kind of home, she said, "We're going to fight about the northern expansion." "I know," he said. "I'm going to win." "You're going to try," he said. She smiled at the window. "Those are the same thing," she said. "Until they work." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, in the particular voice he reserved for things that mattered, "I know," he said. "That's what I'm counting on." 6 months after that, Their daughter arrived at 4 in the morning without waiting for anyone to be fully prepared, which was, Esther would later say, the most accurate thing about her from the very beginning. Fuad held her first. He stood in the corner of the room with this small and entirely new person against his chest and looked at her with an expression Esther had never seen on him. Not the boardroom face, not the controlled face, not any of the faces she had learned and catalogued and understood. Just a man standing at the beginning of something. He looked up and found Esther watching him. She was exhausted. She was completely undone in the specific way that only the most significant things can undo a person who is otherwise very difficult to move. She looked at him and said nothing. He crossed to her, sat beside her, and placed their daughter carefully in her arms with the same deliberateness he brought to every important thing. Not rushed, not careless. Chosen. "She has your posture already," he said. Esther looked down at this small face that had arrived before anyone was ready in the middle of the night without asking permission. "Good," she said, and meant it completely.